talking about benefits, I will just borrow a couple of visuals from Enging's blog. They have a very, very nice story about microservice and how they present it with examples. I think it's pretty nice. So let's go back a little bit to this morning, because in the talk by Chris, it was quite interesting the evolution to microservice architecture. Actually, it was amazing because the engines, they have exactly that example of a Uber-like scenario. So if we look back into some years ago, not so much, the traditional monolithic applications where if you want to do a nice architecture, the tendency was to create the so-called hexagonal architecture, where you have the endpoints outside of the core business logic. It is nice in terms of separate concerns in layers, but the problem, and I'm not going to insist because Chris did pretty well this morning, it's the complexity, how it evolves, the scalability problem that you have, and in general, the evolution. Every time you need to change anything, you need to rebuild, deploy, etc. And that's very, very, very harsh in nowadays. So as an evolution, we can find this microservice architecture where the different logic is isolated in pieces that can be deployed, evolved, etc. And it's as a de facto standard, the interfaces that use these pieces, these microservices, we could say that is REST APIs. Because there was a moment in time where we have the two lines of WSDL, SOAP world, and you have the REST APIs. I would say it's not very risky to say that the industry tendency is clear towards the REST API. In my opinion, is because it's much more easy to use by developers. And at the end, it's not about the power of some technology, but also the ease of use. So yes, I'm sure most of you know pretty well what is a RESTful API, but I just want to spend one slide of REST API 101 in case you are not familiar, and for the rest to see that we are on the same page when we are talking about REST API. So, well, the REST API in the REST paradigm, all the different concepts are traditional concepts that you could find in a model with properties, are translated and accessible by URLs. And typically you have like a version as part of this URL. And the main thing is that you can access this kind of concepts by the HTTP verbs, no? And the typical things are if you want to operate over the whole range of resources of the same type, you access a base URL, and you can, with post, you can create new resources. With get, you can get the whole list of resources of that type. And if you invoke delete, you delete the whole set of resources. It is not, from a best practices point of view, it's not pretty nice to use the put method in that for the whole list of resources. And in the case that you want to operate over a single resource, over a single element, you access explicitly with a specific URL to that resource, and you can do some get to get the information of that resource. You can do some put to update the data of this resource, or delete if you want to delete that specific resource. Then with the idea of the URLs is very powerful to do in a simple way the most typical things that you have in data management in typical applications. So for example, if you want to do some bulk, you don't want to process the whole list of resources, and you want to just do some pages of resources, you can use, for example, the queries and some parameters of limit and offset. If you want to, for example, extract a specific part of the resource, let's say that you have very complex resources and you want to get the whole list of resources with only one part of the resource, like a view of the resource, you can use the fields property. And for example, if you want to, and this is, I think, one of the most interesting things, if you want to link together different resources using the hierarchy, the natural hierarchy of the URLs, you can, for example, link, and if you show this to a user, it's really clear what it represents. If I do a get over this resource, what I get is the logins results, resources from that are tied to a user resource. So we can mix together and navigate through the resources with the URLs, and that's also pretty interesting. So with that in mind, now that we are on the same page in terms of REST APIs, this microservice architecture, I assume that every microservice will have this REST API and will rely on other REST APIs. So what is the benefits? What are the benefits of using an OpenAPI specification tied together with the REST API? Well, the main benefit is that you get all the power of the ecosystem of tooling that you already have with the OpenAPI specification. For example, I will give you 3 specific examples. One, you can do some scaffolding, for example, and in some of the talks of today, they mentioned that you have some toolings that you model your API with the specification. You generate a fully functional mock-up of your API that you can start fill in and create the first prototype. Actually, that is one of the things that we're going to do today. Then you can also, for example, another tool can help you to generate a documentation site for your developers automatically. So your developers have all the list of methods, testing, etc. And finally, another very, very interesting thing is that you can also have testing, automatic testing. There are some toolings that get the specification and generate a set of minimal tests to your API.